Welcome to All Night Society. Listen carefully, because these stories actually happened. I shouldn't have been looking out my bedroom window at 3 in the morning, but the streetlights were flickering again. Our neighborhood is the kind of place where nothing happens after 9 p.m., yet there was Mr. Henderson across the street. He wasn't wearing his usual gardening hat or his bright yellow windbreaker. He was in a dark hoodie, and he was digging a deep, rectangular hole in the center of his pristine lawn. He moved with a mechanical rhythm that made my skin crawl. For 20 minutes, I didn't move an inch, just watched the pile of dark soil grow higher against the moonlight. The first crack in my reality happened when he stopped and looked directly at my window. I don't think he could see me through the heavy curtains, but he stood perfectly still for 3 minutes, staring right at my glass. I backed away into the shadows of my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. My phone sat on the nightstand, its screen glowing with a headline about a local missing person. I told myself he was just planting a tree, even though no one plants a tree in the middle of the night in a suit-shaped trench. I sat on the edge of my bed and waited, listening to the muffled sound of metal hitting dirt over and over. The dread settled in my stomach like lead when I realized the rhythm had changed. The digging had stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the asphalt of his driveway. I forced myself to look again, peeling back a tiny sliver of the fabric. Mr. Henderson was dragging a long, heavy blue tarp toward the hole, and it was sagging in the middle. I picked up the phone to call the police, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped it. But then, the porch light on my own house flickered on, illuminating my driveway and the empty space where my car should have been. I remember locking the front door, but as I looked down the stairs, I saw the deadbolt was pulled back. The mid-reversal hit me like a physical blow when I checked the GPS tracker on my phone for my wife's car. The little blue dot wasn't at her sister's house 3 towns over like she said it would be. The dot was stationary, pulsing precisely in the center of Mr. Henderson's front yard. I didn't call the police. I ran out the front door, screaming her name, sprinting across the black pavement toward the man with the shovel. Mr. Henderson didn't look afraid. He looked incredibly sad. He dropped the shovel and stepped back, holding his hands up as I reached the edge of the hole. I looked down into the trench, expecting to see a body in a blue tarp, but the tarp was empty and folded neatly at the bottom. The hole was deep, professional, and completely vacant. Mr. Henderson pointed toward my house, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely carried in the wind. He told me he wasn't burying anything. He was waiting for me to see what was coming out of my basement. I turned around and saw my front door standing wide open, the dark interior of my hallway looking like a mouth. My wife's car pulled into the driveway a second later, her headlights catching something moving in my upstairs window. She stepped out of the car, looking confused and holding a bag of groceries, asking why I was standing in the neighbor's yard. If she was right there in the driveway, I had to wonder whose phone I was holding in my hand. I looked down at the device I had been using to track her, and the screen now showed a live camera feed of the room I had just left. In the video, a man who looked exactly like me was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring back at the camera. The person in the video waved slowly, and then the feed cut to black. I looked back at the hole Mr. Henderson had dug, and I realized it wasn't for her. It was exactly my size. Before we continue, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to like and subscribe. It really motivates me to keep going. I knew the cabin didn't have cell service before I even climbed into Owen's truck. He was charming in that calculated way that makes you feel like the only person in the room, and I played the part of the smitten date perfectly. We had been driving for 3 hours, deep into the woods where the pine trees grew so thick they choked out the sunset. He kept glancing at me, checking to see if I was getting nervous as the pavement turned to gravel. "It's a bit isolated," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I hope you don't mind the quiet." I smiled and tucked a lock of hair behind my ear, telling him I loved the peace of the mountains. The truth was, I had seen the duct tape and the heavy-duty plastic sheeting in his back seat when he picked me up. Most people would have run, but I had been looking for someone like Owen for a very long time. We reached the cabin, a small timber structure with windows that looked like dark, hollow eyes. He led me inside, holding the door open with a gallant gesture that felt like a practiced ritual. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood, and there was a single heavy chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room. The early subversion happened when he reached for the door to lock it, but I had already slid the deadbolt home myself. I turned to him and asked if he had remembered to bring the charcoal for the grill we talked about. He looked surprised for a heartbeat, his hand still on the lock, before his face shifted into something much sharper and hungrier. He told me we wouldn't be needing the grill, and he reached into his jacket for something metallic. I didn't flinch. I just sat down in the bolted chair and crossed my legs, looking at him with total boredom. I told him his technique was sloppy and that he had been followed by 3 different traffic cameras on the way out of the city. The blood drained from his face as I pulled a small, high-frequency remote from my pocket and pressed the button. Outside, the woods didn't ignite with police sirens. They stayed silent, which was much worse for him. I explained that I didn't work for the law, but for a group of people who found his particular hobby bad for their business. He tried to lung at me, but his knees buckled halfway across the room. The wine I had accidentally spilled on his hand earlier wasn't just wine. It was a potent paralytic absorbed through the skin. He collapsed onto the floor, his eyes darting back and forth in a panic as his muscles stopped responding. I stood up and walked over to him, looking down at the man who thought he was the predator of the evening. I began to spread out the plastic sheeting he had brought, smoothing the crinkles with the toe of my boot. I told him it was poetic that he brought all the supplies himself, as it saved me a lot of preparation time. The moral weight of what I was doing didn't heavy my heart. It felt like cleaning a stain off a countertop. I leaned down and whispered into his ear, telling him that it was okay to be afraid, because that's what he wanted from me. As I reached for his own roll of duct tape, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Underneath his collar, there was a small, tattooed serial number that matched the one on the inside of my own wrist. I realized then that we hadn't met by accident, and I wasn't the one who had chosen this cabin. The door I had locked from the inside didn't have a handle on my side anymore, and from the crawl space beneath the floorboards, I heard the sound of a dozen people starting to clap. Barkley didn't just bark when I pulled into the garage. He let out a low, vibrating growl I had never heard before. He is a golden retriever who usually greets a delivery truck like a long-lost friend, but his hackles were up. He refused to move from the back of the SUV, his nose pressed hard against the crack of the trunk. I reached for the handle, thinking maybe a stray cat had climbed in while I was at the grocery store. The moment the latch clicked, the weight of the door felt wrong, like something was pushing back against the hydraulic lift. I threw it open and fell backward onto the concrete floor. A man was curled into a tight ball behind my shopping bags, his face smeared with grease and sweat. He didn't scream or jump out. He just stared at me with eyes that were wide and bloodshot. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Don't tell him I'm here." I scrambled for my phone, my mind racing through every person I knew, trying to figure out how a stranger ended up in my garage. Barkley was snapping at the air, his teeth inches from the man's dirty jacket. The man reached out a hand, not to hurt me, but to point at the house door I had left slightly ajar. He told me the person who put him in there was already inside my kitchen. My stomach dropped as I heard the familiar sound of my tea kettle starting to whistle on the stove. I live alone, and I hadn't turned the stove on before I left for the store. I grabbed Barkley's collar and backed toward the driveway, but a black sedan blocked the end of my garage. 2 men in suits stepped out, their faces completely blank, looking more like government contractors than police. They didn't ask if I was okay or what was happening. They walked straight to the back of my car and hauled the man out of the trunk by his arms. He didn't fight them. He just went limp, looking at me with a silent, pleading expression that will haunt me forever. One of the men turned to me and handed me a thick manila envelope, telling me I had done a great job. I tried to tell them I didn't know who the man was, but they just nodded and told me the payment for the transport was inside. They put the man in their sedan and reversed out of the driveway before I could say another word. I stood in the silence of the garage, the tea kettle still screaming from inside the house. I opened the envelope and found $50,000 in cash and a photo of myself taken from inside my own living room. The photo was dated 3 weeks ago, during a night I thought I was home alone. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was written in my own handwriting. It said that the next person in the trunk wouldn't be a stranger. I walked into my kitchen to turn off the kettle, and the table was already set for 2 people. My dog, who usually follows me everywhere, stayed in the garage and continued to growl at the empty trunk. The wrongness started the second I stepped onto the curb. I saw her sitting there, hunched over in the exact same way I always do when my back hurts. She was wearing my blue denim jacket with the coffee stain on the left cuff. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun with a green scrunchie. It was me. I stopped walking 3 feet away from the bench. My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. This wasn't a twin or a cousin. This was a perfect replica of my physical body. She was looking down at her phone, her thumb scrolling through the screen in that specific jerky motion I use. She didn't look up when I approached. I stood there, gasping for air, waiting for her to notice the person standing over her. The street was empty. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the fog was so thick I could barely see the streetlights across the road. I finally found my voice and asked her who she was. She didn't flinch. She just kept scrolling. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but my hand stopped an inch away. I felt a strange heat radiating from her skin. It smelled like burnt plastic and old rain. She turned her head slowly. Her face was my face. Every mole, every fine line around the eyes, the slight scar on the chin from a childhood fall. But her eyes were different. They weren't brown like mine. They were a flat, matte black, like 2 holes cut out of paper. I backed away, stumbling into a trash can. The double stood up. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that I definitely didn't possess. She didn't say a word. She just pointed toward the approaching bus. It was the 402, the line I took every day to the insurance office. I looked at the bus, then back at her. She was smiling now. It was a wide, toothy grin that stretched a little too far across her cheeks. She stepped toward me, and I realized she wasn't trying to talk to me. She was trying to overlap with me. She was moving into my personal space, as if she intended to walk right through my skin. I turned and ran. I didn't wait for the bus. I didn't look back at the stop. I ran all the way to the park and hid behind a row of hedges. My lungs were burning, and my vision was swimming. I waited there for an hour, watching the street, expecting to see her come around the corner. She never came. I eventually gathered enough courage to walk home, taking the long way through the residential district. I kept my hood up and my head down. Every time I saw a reflective surface, a shop window, or a puddle, I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see what was looking back. I reached my apartment and fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door and threw the bolt. I leaned against the wood, trying to regulate my breathing. I was safe. I was home. I went into the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. I avoided looking in the mirror, but as I reached for the towel, I saw a flash of blue denim. I froze. There was a blue denim jacket hanging on the hook behind the door. I looked at the left cuff. There was no coffee stain. I looked down at the jacket I was currently wearing. It was perfectly clean. The coffee stain I had lived with for months was gone. I touched my hair. The green scrunchie was missing. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a hollow feeling that made me feel light as air. The doorbell rang. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. There were 2 men in gray uniforms standing there. They were carrying a large black bag and a rolling cart. One of them looked directly into the lens and told me to open up. He said the retrieval team was here to collect the discarded unit. He used my social security number as a reference code. I ignored the first 3 calls because I was busy boiling water for pasta. It was a Tuesday evening, around 6:45 p.m. My phone sat on the granite counter, vibrating in short, aggressive bursts. The screen just said unknown number. I finally wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up on the 4th attempt. I didn't say anything at first. I just listened to the faint hum of static. It sounded like someone was standing in a very large, empty room. Then, a voice came through. It was thin and mechanical, like a recording played through a bad speaker. It said my full name and my social security number. I felt a cold prickle move down my spine. I asked who was calling, but the voice didn't respond to my question. It started listing the contents of my refrigerator. Milk, 3 eggs, half a jar of pickles, and a yogurt that expired 2 days ago. I looked at my fridge door. It was closed. I walked over and pulled the door open. Everything the voice said was true. I stared at the expired yogurt and felt a lump form in my throat. This had to be a prank. Maybe my brother had hidden a camera in the kitchen. I hung up and put the phone face down. My heart was thumping against my ribs. I tried to go back to the stove, but the kitchen felt different now. Every shadow in the corner looked a little too deep. The house was supposed to be empty. I had locked the front door when I got home from work. 10 minutes passed in total silence. I managed to drain the pasta, though my hands were shaking. Then the phone rang again. Same unknown number. This time, I answered it immediately. I was angry now, or at least I was trying to pretend I was. I told them I was calling the police. The voice on the other end didn't sound mechanical anymore. It sounded like my neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He lived 3 houses down and was usually very quiet. He told me to look out the window. He said there was something I needed to see in my own backyard. The midpoint of the conversation changed everything. I realized Mr. Henderson had been dead for 6 months. I had attended his funeral. I had seen them lower the casket into the ground. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to look out the window. I stayed in the middle of the kitchen, frozen. The voice started laughing. It wasn't Mr. Henderson's laugh. It was a wet, gurgling sound that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. It told me that it didn't matter if I looked or not. It was already inside the house. I looked at the basement door. It was a heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar. I always kept that door shut because the latch was broken. A thin sliver of darkness showed through the gap. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel a presence. I backed away toward the front door. My phone was still pressed to my ear. The voice told me to stop moving. It said that the more I moved, the hungrier it got. I reached for the deadbolt on the front door, but my fingers felt numb and heavy. I looked down at the floor. There were wet footprints coming from the basement door. They weren't human footprints. They looked like long, thin needles had been driven into the hardwood. The trail led directly to where I was standing. I finally managed to unlock the door and sprinted to my car. I didn't look back until I was 3 blocks away. I spent the night at a motel on the edge of town. I didn't sleep. I just watched the door of the room, waiting for it to click. The next morning, I went back with 2 police officers. We searched the entire house. Nothing was missing. The basement door was shut and locked. There were no wet footprints on the floor. The officers looked at me like I was having a breakdown. I almost believed them. I thought maybe the stress of my job was finally catching up to me. One of the officers told me to check my call history just to be sure. I pulled out my phone and went to the logs to show him the unknown calls. There were no incoming calls from last night. The log showed that I had made 4 outgoing calls to my own home landline. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed the last detail. My phone's battery was at 100%. It had been at 12% when I ran out of the house, and I hadn't charged it once.